Imagine trying to choose a new brand of camera film, only to realize the only store in town is actively deciding whether your neighborhood gets running water today. This material explores the unprecedented global influence of Elon Musk, examining how his control over critical infrastructure and his distinct ideological worldview elevates his power far beyond that of a typical billionaire.
And it is a deeply fascinating subject to dive into.
It really is. So, let's jump right into the feedback. The argument that free market forces will inherently check infrastructural power relies on a mismatched historical comparison.
You're talking about the Kodak section, right?
Exactly. As I understand it from the notes, the text basically claims that if Musk acts arbitrarily, the market will simply create alternatives, just as it did when Kodak lost its dominance in the photography sector.
Right, the whole creative destruction angle.
Yeah, but I have to admit, reading this part kind of drove me crazy. Comparing a choice of which camera film to buy with the choice of who controls the municipal water supply, or, in this case, global satellite networks, makes me wonder if this free market defense fundamentally misunderstands the barrier to entry.
Is the connection between the Kodak analogy and his aerospace infrastructure fully established in the material, or is that an area to potentially bolster?
It definitely needs bolstering, because we aren't talking about launching a new marketing campaign here. We're talking about literal rocket science.
Yeah, that's the core weakness. Comparing a consumer good like Kodak film to aerospace infrastructure like SpaceX or Starlink, it severely undermines the author's own argument regarding his unique power.
Right, it shrinks the scale of what's actually happening.
Exactly. The text accurately notes that SpaceX currently handles over 50% of global satellite launches, right? And it projects that that figure will soon reach 85%.
Which is just a staggering monopoly.
It is. Yet it simultaneously suggests that a competitor could quickly replace them if he begins acting erratically.
Like someone's just going to whip up a new space agency in a garage?
Right. It entirely overlooks the massive multi-year, multi-billion-dollar geopolitical friction involved in replacing critical war zone infrastructure.
So could the author fix this by just cutting the Kodak analogy entirely? I mean, maybe swap it out for a comparison to defense contractors like Lockheed Martin or Boeing? I feel like that would map a lot better to the reality.
They could, but actually, I think leaving the Kodak analogy in might be a stronger move if they use it as a deliberate point of contrast.
Oh, interesting. So rather than a parallel, use it to show what this isn't.
Exactly. The suggestion here is to explicitly differentiate between consumer markets and infrastructural monopolies. The author should acknowledge that while market correction certainly exists in the abstract, the timeline and the geopolitical stakes make his current monopoly uniquely resilient.
Because consumer goods just never have those kinds of
Right. I think what we are seeing here is a pretty common trap in tech analysis, applying software economics to hardware realities.
Oh, wow, that is a really good point. Because in software, if an app has a terrible user interface or, the CEO does something highly unpopular, a group of developers can spin up a competitor in a weekend.
Yep, and the user base can migrate by Monday.
That's the Kodak analogy at work. But you absolutely cannot pivot your way into a low Earth orbit satellite constellation.
You really can.
The physical infrastructure requires launch pad, regulatory approvals from multiple governments, literal rocket fuel, and specialized manufacturing that takes decades to optimize.
And that is exactly the friction the text needs to address to make this actionable. The author should revise the Kodak section to explicitly address the specific friction of wartime dependency.
Give me an example of how that looks on the page.
So, for example, detail how a state relying on Starlink in acute crises like the operations mentioned in Ukraine or Gaza, they simply cannot wait 2 to 3 years for a market alternative to spin up.
Right, the war would be over by then.
Exactly. Emphasize that his power lies in that immediate, short-term indispensability. If internet access on a front line is cut today, a competitor successfully launching a satellite in 2029 doesn't solve the tactical blackout happening right now.
The text really needs to contrast the elasticity of demand for camera film with the absolute inelasticity of demand for wartime communication. I mean, if I don't like my Kodak film, I buy Fujifilm the next day, or I just don't take pictures.
It's a mild inconvenience.
Right. But if a nation-state doesn't like Starlink, their alternative is losing a war. The demand is totally inelastic. There is no waiting for the invisible hand of the market to fix the problem when troops are under fire.
And by acknowledging that extreme difficulty of replacing this infrastructure, you elevate the threat level of his power, which serves the primary thesis beautifully.
It grounds the economic theory in cold, hard geopolitical reality.
Yes, it transforms a slightly naive economic assumption into a highly sophisticated analysis of modern monopoly power. You move from saying, the market will fix it, to exploring the incredibly dangerous gap of time before the market can fix it.
And that gap of time is where he wields all his influence. It's where the power actually lives, which actually leads right into my next point, because that autocratic approach to infrastructure exposes a massive blind spot later in the text.
Oh, I think I know where you're going with this.
The portrayal of the protagonist's ideological interventions presents a contradiction that is left entirely unexamined in the text. Let's look closely at the section discussing his ideological interventions.
Okay, yeah.
The text characterizes Musk as a libertarian who pushes a specific agenda, noting his direct interventions in providing Iranian internet access during anti-government protests, and his active role in amplifying the UK grooming gang scandal to force a governmental response.
Right, it lists those out pretty explicitly.
But I was reading this thinking, wait a minute, libertarianism is broadly defined by an opposition to centralized power, government intervention, and coercion. So how does a self-proclaimed libertarian reconcile holding and using absolute unchecked geopolitical authority themselves?
That's fascinating. What are the potential limitations or counter-arguments to that idea?
Well, the limitation is that the text doesn't even acknowledge the contradiction.
Right. It's a perfect example of handing the reader two puzzle pieces and just refusing to snap them together. The weakness here is that the text labels him a libertarian, but immediately lists examples of him acting as a unilateral geopolitical arbiter.
It's totally jarring.
It is, uncritically presenting him as a champion of free markets and decentralized power, while detailing how he individually dictates terms to sovereign nations. It just creates a completely disjointed narrative.
It's like describing a strict pacifist and then dedicating the next 3 pages to their extensive collection of naval artillery.
That is a great way to put it.
It drove me crazy, because the author just ignores the elephant in the room. Why not just say his actions prove he's not a libertarian at all? I mean, isn't he just acting like a tech-enabled autocrat?
Calling him an autocrat outright might stray a little too far from the objective tone the author seems to be aiming for. But a better or more analytical approach is to directly interrogate the tension between his stated political ideology and the actual execution of his infrastructural power.
So they should actually explore the contradiction?
Yes. The suggestion is to lean into this paradox to make the analysis sharper and more original. Don't just list the contradictions as separate facts. Analyze the space between them. Look at the friction.
So, practically speaking on the page, how do they do that without just sounding like a cynical critic? Like, how do they make it an intellectual exploration rather than an attack?
By juxtaposing his international activities directly against his stated beliefs. For concrete examples, contrasts his desire to partner with Donald Trump to slash U.S. government spending, which is, a classic textbook libertarian goal, with the reality that his own global influence essentially functions as a shadow government.
Oh, that's a brilliant contrast.
Yeah, the author could explore how his proactive tweeting to force the UK government's hand on a decades-old scandal operates less like a libertarian businessman advocating for free market and a lot more like a targeted political intervention by a highly centralized authority.
I see. So the author could explicitly pose the question in the text, does using immense private wealth to override state policies align with libertarianism? Or is it a new form of state-level power disguised as free enterprise?
Exactly.
Because when you look at the Iran example from the text is wild. Providing internet access to Iranian protesters is framed in the piece almost exclusively as a benevolent pro-freedom act.
Which is how it was broadly covered in the press, yeah.
Right. But the mechanics of it are staggering. A single private citizen decided to bypass the sovereign firewall of a nation-state.
Yeah. A true libertarian purist might argue for the market to eventually provide secure communications, or they might advocate for strict non-interventionism.
Leave it to the people and the market.
Exactly. But this protagonist didn't wait for a market consensus. He simply deployed his private infrastructure to instantly alter a foreign nation's domestic conflict. The author could detail how that level of intervention completely redefines the limits of private citizenship.
It's no longer about whether the market is free. It's about who has the physical capability to impose their will on a country.
Spot on. And I think the reader needs to feel the weight of that.
Definitely. If we accept that he can bypass the Iranian government or force the UK Parliament to address a scandal just because he controls the digital public square, we have to accept that he is acting as an unelected political representative on a global scale.
He's leveraging his platforms the exact way a traditional state would leverage economic sanctions or diplomatic pressure.
It's fascinating, but the text currently just skims over it like it's a normal Tuesday for a tech CEO. Expanding on this tension would make the whole piece feel so much more robust and original.
It absolutely would. It shifts the narrative from a simple biography of a powerful man to a deep philosophical questioning of what happens when private individuals possess the capabilities of a nation-state.
It forces the reader to confront the reality that his wealth isn't just sitting in a bank.
Right. It's being weaponized to achieve specific ideological outcomes that ironically contradict the very ideology he claims to hold.
And that exact libertarian paradox we just discussed is actually what makes the author's next point so frustrating to parse.
Oh.
Yeah, the demographic comparison between various tech billionaires dilutes the central thesis because it lacks a clear tieback to the mechanics of global influence.
Ah, the section on the other tech CEOs.
Yes. So a key theme running through this material seems to be his demographic background. The text pivots heavily into describing him as an aspirational Jew who received a Jewish education in South Africa.
Right.
It then compares him to ethnically Jewish billionaires like Mark Zuckerberg, Larry Page, Sergey Brin, and Larry Ellison, noting who is supportive of Israel and who is distant from their heritage. And I read this and thought, what does this have to do with anything we just talked about?
It really does feel like a sudden shift into sociological trivia.
It felt like a total non sequitur.
Yeah, the fundamental weakness here is that the text spends considerable time detailing the cultural backgrounds of these billionaires, but leaves it hanging as a standalone curiosity.
There is no payoff.
Exactly. It fails to answer the so what of the analysis, meaning it never explains how this cultural affinity materially changes how these men wield their colossal net worths and platform.
It's like analyzing a group of powerful generals and spending 3 paragraphs noting which ones prefer coffee and which ones prefer tea, but never actually explaining if their caffeine habits affect their battlefield strategy.
Perfect analogy.
The text tells us Ellison is supportive of Israel and Zuckerberg is distant from his heritage, and then it just moves on. It drops that information into the narrative void. It just doesn't connect the demographic data back to the central premise of global infrastructural power.
Building on that point, what if we looked at it from the perspective of how personal values dictate corporate action?
That's interesting, but I have to ask, as a reader, I was pretty skeptical. Is it even fair to link a CEO's childhood sociology to their platform's algorithm? Like, isn't code just code?
Oh, absolutely not. Code is entirely shaped by the values, biases, and blind spots of the people who write and govern it. The rules of engagement on any social platform reflect the worldview of its architect, and that's exactly the bridge the author needs to build here.
So how do they fix the section?
The suggestion is to integrate this cultural and demographic analysis directly into the broader discussion of how personal values dictate corporate action and algorithmic bias, ensuring every tangent reinforces the main theme.
Make it relevant to the thesis.
Right. If the author is going to introduce the concept of an aspirational Jew or detail the heritage of the Google and Meta founders, those facts must act as load-bearing pillars for the main argument. They cannot just be interesting factoids floating in the text.
Okay, so if I'm the author, I've got these biographical details. I've got this quote about being an aspirational Jew, and I've got this South African educational background. I want to make them load-bearing. Give me concrete examples of how I actually do that.
You do it by framing these personal affinities as the exact drivers behind their differing approaches to global power. Instead of simply noting that Zuckerberg and Page are distant from their heritage, while Ellison and Musk are supportive, use this section to explain why Musk's platforms might deliberately amplify specific geopolitical narratives, while Google or Meta promote what the text calls radical progressive agendas.
I really want to dig into that why. Because right now, the text doesn't explain what a Jewish education in South Africa actually entails, or how it differs from, say, growing up in suburban America and going to Harvard. What is the actual ideological difference there?
That is the missing piece the author needs to explore. The text should connect his childhood cultural absorption outside of the typical Silicon Valley ecosystem directly to his current willingness to take aggressive, unilateral stands on his platforms today.
So his upbringing makes him more prone to conflict?
Well, the author could explain how absorbing a specific cultural education in a highly polarized, complex society like South Africa, one perhaps focused heavily on distinct community preservation rather than an American melting pot ideal, resulted in a leadership style that favors disruptive, highly personalized interventions.
Oh, I see.
It is a stark contrast to the sanitized, consensus-driven corporate policies we see at Meta or Google.
That makes so much sense, because the founders of Meta and Google were born out of a much more homogeneous American collegiate ecosystem.
Precisely.
They were steeped in a culture of globalized, frictionless expansion, where you try to offend as few people as possible to maximize your user base.
Yes, exactly. And that's how you bridge the gap in the text. You take the aspirational Jew comment, which right now just feels like a provocative quote dropped in for shock value, and you use it to explain his distinct departure from his peers.
You use it to explain his actions.
Right. The text could show how his specific background fosters a worldview that sees the digital public square not just as a neutral place for advertising revenue, but as an active battleground for cultural preservation or political disruption.
It explains his willingness to wade into the mud on the UK grooming gangs issue.
Exactly. Whereas a traditional Silicon Valley CEO would have their PR team draft a neutral statement and stay far, far away from it.
I love that. And for the other billionaires mentioned, the author should demonstrate how their distance from their heritage might correlate with a more globalized, perhaps more corporatized approach to censorship and platform moderation.
Yeah, contrast is key here.
A CEO who views themselves as a global citizen detached from specific community ties might naturally build an algorithm that favors broad consensus and actively suppresses disruptive or localized conflict.
Right. By making these explicit connections, the demographic comparison stops being a tangent and becomes a critical lens through which we understand the deployment of digital power.
It grounds the biography in the geopolitics.
It answers the so what by proving that the specific cultural backgrounds of these tech oligarchs are directly encoded into the rules that govern the global internet. The moderation policies of these platforms are essentially modern foreign policy, and they are being dictated by the CEO's upbringing.
That is such a powerful way to frame it. It takes the text from being a collection of interesting biographical trivia to a profound insight about the human element controlling our digital infrastructure.
It absolutely does.
It proves that algorithms aren't just objective math. They are codified sociology. It shows the reader that the people building our infrastructure are imposing their own specific, localized worldviews onto a global population.
Which is exactly what the author wants to convey. They just haven't quite connected the dots on the page yet.
Well, they have all the puzzle pieces now. To wrap up this critique, the most impactful ways to elevate this material are to first refine the market correction argument by explicitly differentiating between consumer markets and infrastructural monopolies. Say goodbye to the simple Kodak comparison.
Say goodbye to the simple Kodak comparison.
Exactly. You cannot compare the elasticity of demand for camera film to the absolute inelasticity of a wartime satellite network. The author must address the dangerous gap of time before the free market can fix a geopolitical crisis.
Right.
Next, interrogate the tension between a self-proclaimed libertarian ideology and the reality of wielding unilateral state-like power over global conflicts. Don't just list the contradiction of him acting like an autocrat while preaching small government. Analyze the space between those facts and explore what it means for private citizenship.
Lean into the paradox.
Finally, ensure the demographic comparisons among tech billionaires actively serve the core thesis. Connect the childhood sociology directly to the algorithmic bias to show how personal cultural backgrounds dictate the deployment of digital power rather than just treating it as a biographical tangent.
Making those facts load-bearing pillars.
Exact. We invite you to revise your work and submit it again for another critique session. Until then, the next time you look up at the night sky, ask yourself, are you looking at a triumph of the free market or the infrastructure of a shadow government?